Hello, my name is Amanda Woodward, and I will be discussing banning the use of solitary confinement for the mentally ill. The General Court and lawmakers of New England were awakened to the suffering of the homeless insane in 1842 by the voice of Dorothea Dix with her memorial to the Massachusetts legislature. She accidentally discovered the use of jails and prisons to house the mentally ill when she visited them as she shared biblical teachings as a member of her church. She began, "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth in cages, closets, stalls, and pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." 178 years later, we are still penning up our mentally ill in solitary confinement. We are beating them into submission with cell extraction response teams and leaving them naked on suicide watch. With all our country's innovation and technical discovery, with all our condemning of other countries for human rights violations, with all our rage and righteousness surrounding systemic discrimination, and all our blaring claims to return America to greatness, to what time shall we return the current condition of psychotic individuals behind bars? They never left. There have been never-ending reports of mentally ill individuals dying or being victimized in prison or jail settings due to improper treatment or consideration of their condition. In Virginia, several years ago, the tragedy of J. Michael Mitchell's wasting syndrome death prompted long overdue legislative reform. J. Michael had stopped eating as he awaited transfer to a psychiatric hospital for 3 months. The new legislation mandated the creation of new minimum standards for the treatment of mentally ill in Virginia's prisons and jails. One minimum standard should be complete ban on solitary confinement for those with serious mental illness. According to a report on a study undertaken by The Pilot, a Virginia newspaper, and students from Marquette University in Milwaukee, 404 deaths were tracked around the country between 2010 and 2018. The findings were obtained from existing public state data, court records, existing databases, and news reports. The results were consistent with anecdotal evidence. 41% had been in or were in solitary confinement at their time of death. 44% of these died by suicide. 70 of these cases involved the use of tasers or stun guns, pepper spray, or other restraints just prior to their death. It's obvious to any medical professional that being incarcerated for any period of time would lead to a vitamin D deficiency if the inmate were not offered outdoor time or vitamin D supplements. Vitamin D supplementation is not a consideration for most inmates. Some of the health conditions linked to deficiencies are schizophrenia, depression, insomnia, Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, hearing loss, osteoporosis, seizures, and multiple others. Symptoms of deficiency include cognitive problems, mood dysregulations, and depression, among many others. For individuals experiencing these problems to begin with, it only gets worse. If all that were not enough, many segregation units require uninterrupted use of lighting over a 24-hour period. There is a convergence of research into the ill effects of the circadian rhythm disruption. Emotion and mood regulation, gene expression, cellular function, and hormone secretion are under circadian control. Established are the increased incidence of mood disorders, cancers, and metabolic dysfunction with circadian disruption. The solutions to the inappropriate use of solitary confinement to house mentally ill individuals are quite simple. We should stop using solitary confinement, period. We should increase vitamin D supplements to those with mental illness specifically. We should use smaller units to mitigate noise disruption, and also use light in accordance with natural sleep-wake patterns if they have to be incarcerated. And of course, they should have access to mental health care while in prison or jail. The inappropriate use of incarceration for the mentally ill is very costly. In fact, it costs so much that we spend $130 per day to incarcerate a person with mental illness. And if you were to take all the costs involved, including lawyers' fees and court costs, $80 billion per year on correctional costs is spent. The primary stakeholder with the most to gain with the cessation of use of solitary confinement is, of course, the individual himself who ends up being incarcerated with a mental illness. Also, the families of those who are incarcerated are also stakeholders. Of course, prison and jail administrators, elected officials, and detention officers who have to bear the brunt of the care of these individuals, sometimes with poor consequences to themselves. The individuals that have the power to change this situation lie with jail and prison administrations. Elected officials can also have an input into this. Psychiatrists and medical personnel within penal institutions can be influential as well. The evidence shows it just doesn't make sense to house a mentally ill individual in a special housing unit or solitary confinement. If they are sick to begin with, they will likely get much sicker in the course of their incarceration. We have a moral and obligation to stop this. The United States needs to stop incarceration of the mentally ill. We need to reduce the criminalization of mental illness. We need to increase supports out of jails and prisons. We need to use appropriate detention for criminal justice purposes only. And we need appropriate treatment in an appropriate environment for people with no-fault brain illness.